Hey everybody, how's it going? I just wanted to give you guys a little update and an invitation about the Facebook group that I started a couple months ago called Discussions in Science and Religion. And this is a group where we talk about a different topic every month. We've covered a whole bunch of different things so far, where we look at the current research and see what the best evidence is and talk about that from a couple different points of view. And then we break different religious perspectives on the issue down and talk about those. It's a really friendly group where some very deep and challenging conversations where no punches are pulled, but things are done in a friendly and productive kind of way. At least I think I've been really happy with how things have been going so far. In the month of February, we had a great time. That was probably the most intense discussions we've had so far, where we looked at LGBT issues and how those interact with different faith traditions. We spent a good bit of time looking at the science of that. We talked about fetal development and how a lot of sexual orientation and gender identity is laid down in the fetal brain while you're still in utero. We looked at some MRI evidence of how how some of that brain development stuff translates into adults and how those kinds of decisions are made. I also got to do an interview with Paula M. Nera, who is a nurse and a lawyer who has worked on transgender rights issues, especially in the military, for decades now, and got to talk a lot about the current research, some of the politics that are involved with transgender issues specifically. And then she shared a fair bit of her perspective on how her faith tradition growing up has impacted how she sees herself and how she interacts with the world. It was a really, really powerful interview, and I was glad to be able to get to do that. We then looked at verses in the Bible that are brought into the homosexuality specifically kind of debate, and looked at those from different points of view, and we had pretty sharp divisions within the group as to how those kinds of verses were to be interpreted. There's a fair chunk of people in the group who said that a lot of the contexts of the verses in the Bible are not what we're dealing with now, that the Bible doesn't address the modern ideas of monogamous homosexual relationships, and that those verses applied to other things. Like some of them were very specifically about gang rape and cross-dressing in some kind of religious sense that doesn't really apply to current things today. Other people in the group said that there's enough, just the whole evidence of the way they think God created humanity with the male and female genders, and that's just the way that it's supposed to be, and that's the way God designed it, and trying to break away from that is a sin. So we had some good back and forth so far as that goes. So I mean, if you're interested in these kinds of issues, feel free to join the group. It would be great to have you. So what I want to tell you right now is the month that we have coming up for March, or we're already kind of in the middle of it. We're talking about climate change, which I know, like, a lot of times religious perspectives don't necessarily get brought into this. That's not the first thing you think of when you think of climate change controversies, but religious perspectives do have an awful lot to do with how a lot of people interact with it, and I think there's a lot that we can learn by trying to match some religious perspectives up with some of the current science. So for me, the issue of climate change is something that I've been pretty passionate about my entire life. Like, I often joke that I came out of the womb hugging a tree, that just protecting nature and wanting things to be as clean and pristine and well taken care of as possible has been something that's been really important to me for my entire life. I've spent an awful lot of my life in the outdoors, camping, fishing, hiking, backpacking, all of that kind of stuff. Especially, I'm a Cub Scout leader now, so I get to spend a lot of time doing that, and conservation has always been incredibly important to the Scouts. And so I never really questioned what we're calling the consensus view, that human behavior is causing global warming, climate change, which are two different things, which we'll talk about within the group, and that we should be doing absolutely everything we can to mitigate those effects and to prepare for the future and to leave the best possible world for our kids and our grandkids. That's not something I ever had any doubts about whatsoever. But then as I was preparing for the discussion this month, I was doing an awful lot of background reading, specifically from the skeptical point of view, because I was like, well, it's got to just be, it's a political divide, and if you're a Republican, you have to be a denier. If you're a Democrat, you have to believe the stuff. Although that's becoming less and less the case. We've got people starting to switch both directions. And I but I wanted to, I realized that I hadn't ever actually given the skeptical point of view any real credence. I had just, like the line I would always say is like, I trust the scientific community. Like I think that they have there's enough mechanisms built into the scientific method that, errors of that kind of magnitude, like if climate change isn't really going to be a thing insofar as some human-induced apocalyptic future, like if that's not going to be a thing, like the scientific community would have figured that out. We couldn't have all of them, lying about it together. I trusted the scientific community. But then in the last 3 or 4 weeks, as I've been doing a lot of reading from the skeptical point of view, I realized that I have not at all necessarily been fair to the skeptical position, that there is actually some decent arguments that are to be made about certain things, both about some of the actual scientific evidence and about the scientific community in general. There's at least an argument that needs to be heard so far as whether there is some groupthink going on within the IPCC and the scientific community in general. Whether, you hear stories about researchers who try and publish information that's contrary to the popular view, and they're just not able to get it published because the publishing journals don't want to have anything to do with it. Or we also have heard stories where professors who have done some research that shows some things that don't comply with the consensus view have lost their jobs as professors, as scientists, because they it's just not it's not what the majority wants to hear or to think about. So there's that. So is there anything to that? Is this just is it being, is real evidence being repressed here, or is there something else going on? You can also think about, and then on the other side of things, there are some scientists who say that that are skeptical of the consensus view that humans are inducing climate change, and that we only have a couple years to straighten some things out. So there are some scientists who disagree with that point of view, and they're cast enough doubt that certain parts of the population, our president and most of the administration are admittedly climate deniers. So because we've got those couple of scientists, are they just providing plausible deniability for the skeptical point of view? That's another issue. Looking back historically, there have been other issues. For example, when the consensus medical opinion was that tobacco was definitely nicotine, causes lung cancer. When that was first coming out, the 60s and 70s, early 80s even, we had a small minority point of view that scientists, doctors who worked with the tobacco industry, who came out and said that they didn't believe that nicotine caused cancer, and then so it gave enough plausible deniability to the industry to be able to keep things legal for much longer. And in that period, tens of thousands of people got lung cancer and died, even though the medical community had a consensus that nicotine does cause cancer. So it was just this couple of scientists who had this aberrant view that kept the truth from coming out. Now there's not any controversy about that whatsoever. We know that nicotine causes cancer, and yet those couple of scientists who had this other view held things up and caused a lot of damage because of that. So is that the same thing here, where we have just a couple of scientists who are holding out for whatever reason? Maybe they really believe it. Maybe there is moneyed interests involved. So that's just something that I'm wrestling with. I don't know enough about a lot of these things to make an educated guess, to make an educated opinion. And maybe that's really the biggest thing about having these climate change conversations, is that it's such a complicated issue. What we're going to be talking about is, how do we even make decisions as individuals, as citizens who have to vote on some of these issues, and for politicians who have opinions one way or the other? How do we make decisions when it's so complicated, and even the experts aren't in 100% agreement, and even, it's just so freaking complicated. What do we do? So we'll be talking a lot about that within the next couple of weeks in the group. Let's see here. So after we get done talking through some of the science and some of the politics, we're going to be talking about religious perspectives on what humanity's responsibility toward the earth is. And there have been some widely divergent views on this throughout throughout history, where people have taken the same exact verses out of the Bible, for example, and come with like almost contradictory ways of applying it. So what I want to do right now is read a couple verses out of Genesis and talk about some views that have come out of that. So we're going to read, this is Genesis 1. So this is the first version of the creation story, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28. I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So one of the traditional positions is that these verses, God has given humanity dominion over the rest of the nature, and we can do with it whatever we want. That the earth belongs to us, and we're the ones who are supposed to rule it, and we get to make the decisions about what's best, for us or for the rest of the earth. And we keep the, what's best for the animals and for the climate in general in mind, and maybe we don't. Maybe all that matters is what is best for humanity. So that would be called like a dominionist point of view, like humans have dominion over nature. On the extreme end of that view, especially within fundamentalist circles in America and certain parts of Europe and Africa right now, and even actually fundamentalist circles within Christianity all over the world. I guess it's not just America, although America seems to be the hotbed for it. We have a millenarianist point of view, which is it's a view of the end times, that the world is going to end, that humans are going to be caught up, or believers are going to be caught up into heaven, and then God's going to destroy the earth with fire, and it's going to be, things are just going away. So I've had a number of people who have said to me personally that it's all going to burn anyway, so why should we even bother taking care of things? Like, why are you wasting your time and your money recycling when the earth's just going to burn? Like, screw this earth. We're going to get we're going to heaven anyway, or maybe some people believe like we're going to get a new earth. So why should we even bother wasting resources on taking care of this one? I've heard a number of Christians in my local area say this view to me. On the other end of the spectrum, we have what would be called the stewardship model, where people take those same verses out of Genesis and say this is not God saying we're supposed to rule over nature with an iron fist, is doing whatever we want with it, but that it's our job and our responsibility as humans to take care of it, to be like gardeners who foster the earth to make it be the best and most productive that it can be, in some kind of healthy symbiotic relationship, that we are part of the whole greater nature, and it's our job to, we are the most intelligent and the most powerful species out there, although, maybe that intelligence can be questioned a little bit, but we have certain abilities that no other species on the earth has ever had by, many factors, and it should be our responsibility to take care and to foster and to, not to rule over it as something that, where we just take from earth what we want, but it's our job to foster and nurture like a parent would with a child. So those are two pretty different views, and we're going to talk about some of the assumptions that they make and the consequences of having a belief like that and what that does to how you interact with the world. So I think there's actually quite a good bit of stuff to talk about here, from economic points of view, from political points of view, from religious points of view, and then just understanding some of the basic science, which is super, super complicated. So there's plenty to talk about. The next couple weeks are going to be pretty cool in this group, so I encourage you, if you're interested in this kind of stuff at all, to join the discussion group. It's Discussions in Science and Religion. So we've got a couple of interviews that are happening within the group. I already interviewed my friend from high school, Dr. Kate Belinsky, who's a geoscience professor at Bellarmine University, and she goes over some of the basic science of some of what her research has been, and some of the scientific method and how that works, and why she thinks trusting the consensus view is the way to go. And then I'm also have interviews planned, haven't done them yet, so I'm hoping this works out, with two other members of the group. Andy Durr, a good friend of mine from a long time ago, is, I guess you could call him a climate skeptic, where he doesn't necessarily think that humans are the major force of what's going on, that there are just natural cycles that happen within nature, and that we don't need to be so alarmist and so, cataclysmic about what's coming in the next couple of years. He also thinks that the consensus view, the IPCC, is largely just a bunch of groupthink, that this is the view that became popular, and then it was just unacceptable to have any other view, so it's not actually trusting the scientific method to the best of its ability. And we'll talk about that. And then I'm also hoping within the next couple of days to do an interview with another friend of mine from the church that I grew up in as a kid, Joe Hagan, who is one of the few people who's made a dramatic shift in his perspective, where he was a denier for a long time, but then as he has continued to look at the evidence, he's recently come out and publicly said that he has shifted his position, that he now believes, to some extent at least, we'll get into the details, the consensus view, and is said that humans are causing some of this, and that we do have to make some changes in order to avoid some drastic consequences in the future. So I'm really looking forward to some good discussion in the next couple weeks, and I think it's going to be a great time. So come and join us. It'll be good. Take care.